There is a bottle in this story. Small, glass 1 ounce. The label on its face reads, in block capitals, "Poison not to be taken." On the first morning of 1886, in a rented flat at 85 Claverton Street, Pimlico, this bottle was found inverted in a tumbler beside the body of a man who would never open his eyes again. It was nearly empty. Its contents had travelled somewhere they should not have been able to go. The man was Thomas Edwin Bartlett, 40 years old, a grocer by trade, a property investor by ambition, a hypochondriac by compulsion, and, by every account from every person who knew him, one of the strangest husbands the Victorian age ever produced. The woman asleep in the same room was his wife, Adelaide Blanche de la Tremoille, born in Orleans, France, in 1855, to parents whose identities were themselves a kind of mystery. And the question that would consume London, consume the Old Bailey, consume the medical profession, and consume every drawing-room and public house from Pimlico to Pall Mall was not the usual one. The question was not who killed Edwin Bartlett. Everyone had a fair idea about that. The question was how. And no one, from the most distinguished surgeon to the most determined prosecutor, could answer it. Claverton Street in the winter of 1885 was a narrow residential lane in the southern reach of Pimlico, running north from the Thames toward the bustle of Lupus Street. The houses were 4-story stucco terraces with iron railings around their basement areas, built in the 1840s for the respectable lower middle class of Westminster. Gas lamps. Soot-darkened brickwork, the sound of horse-drawn omnibuses on Vauxhall Bridge Road 2 streets east. Pimlico was not fashionable. It was not poor. It sat in that peculiar Victorian geography of striving, where grocers and clerks and widowed gentlewomen lived in rooms that were slightly too cold, slightly too damp, and meticulously maintained against the judgment of neighbours who noticed everything. Number 85 was owned by a Mr. Frederick Dockett and his wife. The Bartletts had taken rooms on the first floor in August of that year. They were quiet tenants. Edwin was out most days tending to his chain of grocery shops, leaving before dawn on some mornings, riding the omnibus into the city by 6. Adelaide kept to herself. She had dark eyes, a French accent softened by years in England, and an air of composed reserve that struck some as elegance and others as concealment. She also had, sleeping in the room most nights, or visiting during the day with a frequency that no one in the household could ignore, a 27-year-old Wesleyan minister named George Dyson. If you are a subscriber to this channel, you already know how this kind of arrangement unfolds in the Victorian world. But I want you to hold your assumptions for a moment, because the triangle at the heart of the Pimlico mystery is not the one you are expecting. It is stranger, it is more unsettling, and the person who orchestrated it was not the wife and not the minister. It was Edwin Bartlett himself. If this is your first time here, and you have found yourself pulled into this world of gaslight and chloroform and impossible deaths, you are exactly who we built this channel for. Subscribe, stay the stories only get deeper from here. To understand what happened on New Year's Eve 1885, you have to understand the marriage. And to understand the marriage, you have to begin in 1875, when a 30-year-old grocer named Edwin Bartlett was paid a sum of money by a mysterious Frenchman to marry his 19-year-old daughter. Adelaide Blanche de la Tremoille was born out of wedlock in Orleans. Her father was almost certainly Adolphe Coyote de la Tremoille, Comte de Troyes d'Escurey, a man of title and moderate wealth whose name appeared on no birth certificate, and whose face Adelaide may never have clearly remembered. Her mother was an obscure English woman named Clara Chamberlain, who died when Adelaide was still a child. The girl was raised by relatives, first in France and then in England, where she was sent to live with a maternal aunt and uncle in Kingston upon Thames. She was beautiful, she was intelligent, she was, in every legal and social sense, a problem that needed solving. An illegitimate daughter with a foreign name and no verifiable parentage was not a person the Victorian world knew how to place. She needed a husband, and the Comte, operating through intermediaries, found one. Edwin Bartlett was the son of Charles Bartlett, a prosperous grocer with shops across South London. Edwin was not handsome, he was not charming. He was, by the descriptions of those who met him, a man of settled satisfaction and abstracted eyes, more interested in theories of animal magnetism and mesmerism than in the ordinary pleasures of the flesh. But he was solvent, he was respectable, and he was willing. The marriage contract contained 3 stipulations. Edwin would take sole responsibility for Adelaide. He would never refer to her illegitimate background, and he would continue her education at his own expense. On the 6th of April 1875, they married at Croydon Parish Church. The bride was 19, the groom was 30, and on the day after their wedding, Edwin Bartlett did something that no groom in living memory had done before. He sent his new wife away to boarding school. Adelaide spent the next year at a residential school in Stoke Newington, a leafy suburb north of the city, where the daughters of aspiring tradesmen were taught deportment and needlework and the rudiments of household management. From there, Edwin sent her to a Protestant convent in Belgium. She had been raised Catholic. He made her convert. The convent lasted another year. By the time Adelaide returned to England in late 1877, she was 22 years old, fluent in French and English, educated in the decorative arts of a middle-class wife, and married to a man she had lived with for a total of perhaps 3 weeks. What she found when she finally moved into his home, a set of rooms above one of his grocery shops in Herne Hill, South London, was not what anyone would call ordinary. Edwin Bartlett was a man of routines so particular they bordered on ritual. He rose early. He left for his shops by 6 in the morning, riding the tidal train or the omnibus into the city. He was a grocer by profession, but not the kind who stood behind a counter measuring sugar into bags. He was a proprietor, a manager of a small chain, a man who spent his days checking accounts and supervising deliveries and maintaining the precise respectability that his trade demanded. Grocers in Victorian London occupied a peculiar rung of the social ladder. They were merchants, not gentlemen. They handled money, not ideas. But a successful grocer with multiple premises and a clean reputation could aspire to a life that looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from the lower professional class. Edwin aspired. He was also, beneath the grocer's exterior, a deeply strange man. He read extensively on the subject of animal magnetism, a pseudo-scientific theory developed by Franz Mesmer in the 18th century, which proposed that all living things were imbued with an invisible natural force that could be manipulated through touch, gaze, and will. Edwin believed in mesmerism as a key to health. He believed in the power of the mind to influence the body. He believed, or claimed to believe, that a properly mesmerized wife could be directed in ways that an unmagnetized one could not. These were not casual interests, they were convictions, and they shaped every aspect of his marriage. He also collected condoms. This detail emerged at trial and was never explained. Adelaide claimed the marriage was platonic. The condoms suggested otherwise. The midwife, Annie Walker, observed that the Bartletts always slept in the same bed and believed that Adelaide's story of a single act of intercourse was in fact a story of a single act of unprotected intercourse. The distinction mattered. It suggested that Edwin's theories about platonic marriage were not abstinence, but control, a system in which physical intimacy existed, but reproduction was prevented, and the terms were set entirely by him. According to Adelaide, and this testimony would become central to everything that followed, the marriage was intended from the start to be platonic. Edwin believed in a philosophy of companionship without physical intimacy. He believed, or said he believed, that a man might have two wives, one for intellectual companionship and one for the production of children, and that the arrangement was both moral and natural. Whether this was genuine conviction, pathological aversion, or something darker, no one has ever fully determined. But in 1881, Adelaide became pregnant. She would later claim it was the only time she and Edwin had been intimate in their entire marriage. The labor was difficult. The baby was stillborn. Edwin refused to allow a male doctor into the room. "I do not want another man to interfere with her," he told the midwife, a woman named Annie Walker. Walker contradicted Adelaide's story of a platonic marriage. She observed, quietly, that the Bartletts always slept in the same bed. And here is where the marriage becomes something else entirely. In January 1885, the Bartletts met the Reverend George Dyson at a Wesleyan chapel in Merton, on the outskirts of London. Dyson was 27, dark-haired, romantically inclined, and spectacularly susceptible to flattery. He had recently been promoted to a new post, placed in charge of a large parish in Putney, and he carried himself with the self-importance of a young man who believed his career in the church was only beginning. He wrote poetry. Bad poetry. Verse addressed to Adelaide that later generations have not judged kindly. Who is it that hath burst the door, unclosed the heart that's shut before, and set her queen like on its throne, and made its homage all her own? My birdie, that is not the work of a man exercising restraint. Edwin Bartlett was enchanted. Not with Dyson's verse, presumably, but with the man himself. He hired Dyson to tutor Adelaide in Latin, history, geography, and mathematics. He bought Dyson a railway season ticket from Putney to Waterloo so that the minister could visit Adelaide during the day while Edwin was at work. He referred to Dyson, in letters and in conversation, as Georgius Rex. He encouraged the two of them to embrace in front of him. He altered his will, naming Dyson as executor and removing a clause that had previously forbidden Adelaide from remarrying after his death. The new will left everything to Adelaide, on the implied understanding that she would marry Dyson. In September 1885, Edwin rented a house on the English Channel coast in Kent, near Dover, to spend a rare stretch of leisure time with Adelaide and their two St. Bernard dogs. Adelaide was frequently seen striding along the cliff tops, the enormous dogs at her heels, gazing across the water toward France and the childhood she had left behind. Dyson visited Dover repeatedly, staying for days at a time. Edwin paid his train fares. Edwin paid for a day trip to Calais. Edwin addressed him as Georgius Rex, and Adelaide did the same. Edwin's father, visiting from London, knew nothing of Dyson's existence. When the Bartletts returned to London and took the flat at 85 Claverton Street in Pimlico in August 1885, Edwin bought Dyson a new season ticket so the visits could continue. The flat was small, 2 rooms on the first floor. Adelaide and Edwin in the front room, the bedroom. A sitting room behind it. The landlord and his family below. And into this intimate domestic space George Dyson arrived with the regularity of a tram. The maid, Alice Fulcher, walked in on Dyson and Adelaide on the floor of the parlour. The curtains were pinned shut. She walked in on them more than once. The positions, she would later testify, were unusual for pupil and teacher. Edwin, when told, did not object. He seemed by every account pleased. "Now, I want you to picture this scene and hold it in your mind. A grocer with rotting teeth and a fascination with animal magnetism. A beautiful French wife he appears to have purchased. A young clergyman he has installed in his household with something between generosity and design. The 3 of them living in 2 cramped rooms on the first floor of a Pimlico terrace, the landlord downstairs pretending not to notice, the maid noticing everything. This is not a love triangle. This is a controlled experiment. And the subject is Adelaide. In the autumn of 1885, Edwin's health began to fail. He had always been fragile, a man who catalogued his own symptoms with the devotion others reserved for stamp collecting. He suffered from rotting teeth, the legacy of a dentist who, years earlier, had sawed his teeth down to the gums for dentures and left the stumps and roots to fester. He may have had tapeworms. He believed at various times that he had syphilis, internal tumours, and unnamed ailments that no doctor could identify. He took mercury pills. He consulted quacks. He lay in bed and required Adelaide to sit beside him, holding his foot. Edwin would not settle, Adelaide told Dr. Alfred Leach, the physician treating him, unless I sit and hold his toe. By December, Edwin was bedridden. He was losing weight. His breath was foul. Dr. Leach attended him daily and was puzzled. The symptoms did not add up to any single diagnosis. The rotting teeth alone could have produced the infection, the fever, the general wasting. But there was something else. A nervousness. A depression. An air of a man who had lost the energy to resist whatever was happening to him. Christmas 1885 was terrible for Edwin. By the 28th of December, Dr. Leach thought he was rallying. Edwin sat up. He ate a little. He spoke about the new year. On the same day, the 28th of December, George Dyson made a tour of 3 chemists' shops in Putney and Wimbledon. At each, he purchased a small quantity of chloroform. He told the chemists he needed it to remove grease stains from clothing. Under the law of the time, large purchases of chloroform required a signature in the poison register. Small purchases did not. Dyson bought 4 small bottles instead of 1 large one. He combined them into a single bottle of approximately 4 ounces. On the 29th of December, during a walk along the embankment, he gave the bottle to Adelaide. She had asked him to obtain it. She told him it was for Edwin's medical treatment. She told him it would ease the paroxysms that his doctor did not recognize. She did not explain why she had not asked Dr. Leach to prescribe it himself. Dyson did not ask. Let me be honest for a moment. This is the detail that for me changes everything about this case. A minister of the church walks into 3 separate chemists' shops. He lies about his reason for buying a volatile poison. He combines the purchases to avoid the register. He hands the result to the wife of a man whose will he has just been named executor of. And he does not ask a single question.
If you are watching this, you already know how a true crime story ends. So here is something almost no one knows. How 10 of these cases changed the law itself, the real reason the rules you trust today exist. This is only for the brave souls and the true crime seekers, the ones who do not just want the verdict, but what the ground kept after the courtroom buried it. We built something for you. 10 true cases, 40 archival engravings, 200 pages, told in the plain voice of a 19th century crime journal. No invention, no shock for its own sake. One question runs under every chapter, and once you read it, you will never look at a verdict the same way again. The door is here. Most will scroll past it. You will not. Go grab it before the launch price ends. Thank me later.
That is either the most extraordinary naivety in the history of the English clergy, or it is something else entirely. If you are still here, if this story has drawn you into the gaslight and the fog and the smell of chloroform in a rented Pimlico bedroom, I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from tonight? Leave it in the comments below, and while you are there, tell me this. Do you believe George Dyson was naive, or do you believe he knew exactly what he was doing? On New Year's Eve, the 31st of December 1885, Edwin Bartlett returned from a visit to the dentist. His teeth were in agony. His mouth was raw. He went to bed early in the front room of their first-floor flat, sleeping on a sofa bed. Adelaide, as had become her habit during his illness, lay down on a cot at the foot of the bed. The landlord, Miss Doggett, retired to his own rooms below. The house went quiet. What happened next is the center of a mystery that has persisted for 140 years. At approximately 4 o'clock in the morning of New Year's Day 1886, Adelaide tapped on the Doggett's bedroom door. "Come down," she said. Her voice was calm. "Controlled, I think Mr. Bartlett is dead." He was. Edwin Bartlett lay on his back in the sofa bed. He was cold. He had been dead for hours. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no marks on his body. There was a wineglass on a nearby table, 3/4 full of a liquid that smelled of brandy and something else. Something sweet. Something that, when the landlord leaned close, burned faintly at the back of his nostrils. The smell was chloroform. Edwin's father, Thomas Bartlett Sr., arrived the following day. He had always detested Adelaide. He had once accused her of conducting an affair with Edwin's younger brother Frederick, a claim Edwin had furiously denied and forced his father to retract before a solicitor. Now, standing over his son's body, the elder Bartlett smelled the same sweet chemical odor. He demanded an inquest. The post-mortem was performed on the 2nd of January by Dr. Green of Charing Cross Hospital and 4 other physicians. What they found inside Edwin Bartlett's body defied everything they understood about toxicology. But before the post-mortem results were known, something happened that the prosecution would later present as one of the most damning moments in the entire case. While the inquest was pending, Adelaide and George Dyson met at the house of a mutual friend, a Mrs. Matthews. He was, by all accounts, deathly pale. Adelaide had lost the olive warmth of her complexion and looked sallow and drawn. They were both agitated. Mrs. Matthews was in the room. "You told me that Edwin would die soon," Dyson began, his voice low but not low enough. Adelaide said nothing. There was a long silence. Dyson's eyes were cast down. Then, nervously, almost timidly, he said, "I wish you would give me back those papers of mine, Adelaide." She looked at him. The account says she looked at him with scorn. She saw, clearly enough that the man who had benefited most from his friendship with the Bartletts, the man who had received season tickets and train fares and day trips to Calais, and the affection of a woman whose husband had paid him to take it, this man was already calculating his own escape. "Don't mince matters," Adelaide said. "Say, if you wish to, that I gave him chloroform." Dyson did not reply. He walked away. The two of them, by most accounts, never spoke again. The post-mortem results arrived, and they changed everything. Edwin's stomach contained approximately 1 ounce of liquid chloroform, enough to kill a man twice over. The dose was 100 times greater than any therapeutic amount. It was not diluted. It was not mixed with food. It was pure liquid chloroform, sitting in his stomach as though it had been poured there. But here is the fact that turned a suspicious death into a forensic impossibility. Edwin Bartlett's throat showed no burns. His larynx showed no damage. His windpipe was clean. His mouth, despite its pre-existing infections, showed no chemical scarring of the kind that liquid chloroform invariably produces. Liquid chloroform is a corrosive, volatile substance. It burns tissue on contact. It cannot pass through the human throat without leaving evidence of its passage. A person forced to swallow it would scream. A person surprised by it would choke, would vomit, would struggle. The burning would be visible for hours, if not days. The pain would be extraordinary. And there would be splashing, aspiration into the lungs, damage to the trachea. None of this had happened. The chloroform was inside Edwin Bartlett's stomach. It had not touched anything on the way down. This is the locked room of the human body. The poison was inside. There was no door. Dr. Leach, the attending physician, was the first to confront this paradox. He told Adelaide what the autopsy had found. Her response has been recorded and repeated in every account of the case for 140 years. "I wish anything but chloroform had been found," she said. She then admitted that she had been in possession of chloroform. She explained that Edwin had recently renewed his sexual interest in her, an interest she did not welcome, and that she had used the chloroform as a kind of defense, dripping it onto a cloth and holding it near his face to make him drowsy and turn his attention away. She said she had placed the remaining chloroform on the mantelpiece before going to sleep. She said she did not know how it had ended up inside him. No one believed her. But no one could prove she was lying. On the 11th of February, 1886, the coroner's inquest under Mr. A. Braxton Hicks returned a verdict of willful murder against Adelaide Bartlett, with George Dyson named as an accessory before the fact. Both were arrested. The trial opened at the Old Bailey on the 12th of April 1886, before a public gallery packed to overflowing and a press corps that had not seen a case this sensational since the Palmer poisoning 30 years before. The trial lasted an entire week. Every day the galleries were full hours before proceedings began. Women in particular came in extraordinary numbers, a detail that the press noted with the mixture of fascination and disapproval that Victorian journalism reserved for any evidence that women might be interested in something other than domestic tranquility. Sir Charles Russell, the Attorney General of England himself, led the prosecution. Russell was a formidable barrister, Irish-born, silver-tongued, a man who had built his career on cases of national importance. He presented the evidence methodically. The chloroform purchases, the lies Dyson told to obtain it, the alteration of the will, the affair, the fact that Adelaide was alone with Edwin when he died. The fact that she admitted possessing the poison that killed him. It was a circumstantial case, but every thread pointed in the same direction. George Dyson took the stand. The charges against him had been dropped at the prosecution's request, a tactical decision that allowed the Crown to use him as a witness. The strategy was double-edged. Dyson was now free to testify, but the defense could also question him, and Edward Clarke had every intention of doing so. Dyson's testimony was self-serving to a degree that struck observers as remarkable. He claimed there had been no secret understanding between himself and Adelaide. He claimed there had been no impropriety between them. He said he threw his chloroform bottles away out of panic, not guilt. He said he went to several different chemists merely to obtain the full quantity Adelaide had requested, not to avoid the register. He said he lied about the grease stains because he wanted to avoid tedious explanations, not because he was concealing a murder plot. Clarke dismantled him. The defense barrister made Dyson look like a man who had accepted every benefit the Bartletts offered: the money, the train tickets, the access to a beautiful woman, and who was now trying to distance himself from the consequences with the desperation of a man who knew exactly how deep his involvement went. The more closely Clarke could associate Dyson's behavior with Adelaide's, the more he strengthened the jury's reluctance to send her to the gallows while Dyson walked free. And then Clarke did something that no one expected. He was facing the finest prosecution the Crown could mount. The circumstantial evidence was devastating, and he called no witnesses for the defense. Not one. Adelaide herself could not testify. Under the law of 1886, a defendant in a criminal trial was not permitted to give sworn evidence on their own behalf. That right would not exist until the Criminal Evidence Act of 1898, 12 years too late for Adelaide Bartlett. The coroner at the inquest had tried to find a way around this restriction, believing that Adelaide's account of the marriage and the chloroform was essential to understanding the case. He failed. The law was absolute. Adelaide sat in the dock and listened while strangers interpreted her life, her marriage, and her motives, and she was not permitted to say a single word in her own defense. Clarke instead delivered a closing statement that lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of a single voice in the oak-panelled courtroom of the Old Bailey, dismantling every theory the prosecution had advanced, returning again and again to the same unanswerable question. How? How was this done? On the 17th of April 1886, the jury retired. They returned with a verdict that the foreman delivered in words that have become as famous as the case itself. Although we think grave suspicion is attached to the prisoner, we do not think there is sufficient evidence to show how or by whom the chloroform was administered. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. The galleries cheered. Adelaide Bartlett, the illegitimate daughter of a French count who had been purchased as a bride and then freed by a death that science could not explain, walked out of the Old Bailey into the April sunlight. And then Sir James Paget spoke. Paget was the sergeant surgeon to Queen Victoria. He was the most eminent medical man in England. He was not a man given to public quips or courtroom commentary, but the Pimlico mystery had done something to him that decades of surgical practice had not. It had humiliated his profession. It had presented a medical impossibility and then walked it through the front door of the Old Bailey and set it free. Now that she has been acquitted for murder and cannot be tried again, Paget said, in a remark that was printed in every newspaper in the country within 24 hours, she should tell us, in the interest of science, how she did it. Let that sentence settle in your mind. The most powerful surgeon in England did not question whether Adelaide had killed her husband. He questioned only how. And he asked her, publicly, to explain, because the manner of the killing represented an advance in the application of poison that the medical profession had never encountered and could not replicate. Adelaide never answered. She never spoke publicly about the case again. She left England. Some accounts place her return to Orleans. Others say she went elsewhere. George Dyson was expelled from the Wesleyan ministry for his conduct. Some say he emigrated to America. Some say Australia. By most accounts, the two never saw each other again. The truth of what happened in that room at 85 Claverton Street has generated a century and a half of speculation. In 1994, Dr. Michael Farrell published the most widely cited modern theory in the British Medical Journal. He proposed that Adelaide handed Edwin a glass of brandy laced with chloroform and told him to drink it quickly. The strong taste of brandy could have masked the burning of the chloroform. Edwin's mouth raw and swollen from his recent dental surgery, his gums riddled with infection from years of rotting stumps, may have been too damaged to register the pain until the liquid had already passed into his stomach. The chemical reaction between chloroform and alcohol would have produced chloric ether, the sweet-smelling gas that the landlord detected in the room. It is the simplest solution. It requires no mesmerism, no unknown technique, no advancement in the science of poisoning. It requires only a glass, a lie, and a man whose mouth hurt too much to taste what was killing him. But even Farrell acknowledged that the case for suicide was, by a narrow margin, slightly more convincing than the case for murder. Edwin Bartlett was a man fascinated by quack medicine, a man who kept chloroform in his bedroom, a man whose health had been failing for weeks. Could he have drunk the chloroform himself, whether to end his life or in a confused, pain-addled attempt to self-medicate, gulping it so fast that it bypassed his ravaged throat before the burning could register? It is possible. It is not likely, but it is possible. And that is the margin on which Adelaide Bartlett's freedom rested, not innocence. Possibility. Now, here is what I want you to consider. The system that tried Adelaide Bartlett was not designed to deliver justice to a woman like her. She was not born into a name that carried weight. She was illegitimate. She was French. She was married off to a man she did not choose. She was denied the right to speak in her own defense, silenced by a law that treated defendants as too unreliable to testify under oath. She was judged by a jury of men who had heard, in open court, about her affair with a clergyman and the bizarre sexual arrangements of her marriage. And she was prosecuted by the Attorney General of England himself. She should have hanged. By every measure of circumstantial evidence, she should have been convicted. She had the motive, she had the means, she had the opportunity. And the only thing that saved her was a paradox that belonged not to the law, but to chemistry. The chloroform was inside Edwin, but it had left no trace of its passage, and because the prosecution could not explain the mechanism, they could not prove the act. This is the case that turned a murder into a scientific question and a defendant into a riddle. And the riddle was never solved, not by Paget, not by Farrell, not by anyone. Adelaide Bartlett vanished from the public record as completely as the chloroform had vanished from Edwin's throat. Within weeks of the acquittal, she disappeared from London. No forwarding address was left with the landlord at Claverton Street. No correspondence was received by anyone connected to the case. George Dyson never saw her again. Dr. Leach never heard from her again. Edward Clarke, who had saved her life with that 6-hour closing speech, never received a letter of thanks, a visit, or even a note acknowledging what he had done for her. She simply ceased to exist in the documentary record of the country that had tried and acquitted her. Some researchers have speculated that she returned to France, to Orleans, to the city of her birth and the family that had arranged her marriage to an English grocer when she was 16. Others have suggested she went to America, where the anonymity of a continent might swallow a name that was famous only in England. There is no evidence for either theory. There is no evidence of anything. Adelaide Bartlett did not die on a public record in England. She did not remarry under her own name. She did not surface in census returns, or passenger manifests, or parish registers. She did not write a memoir, though the market for such a document would have been considerable and the publishers eager. She left behind no confession, no explanation, no forwarding address. She carried the answer with her, and wherever she went, whether back to Orleans or into some new identity in some new country under some new name, she kept it. The medical profession, meanwhile, was left with the question that Paget had posed, and that no one could answer. In the decades following the trial, several physicians attempted to replicate the administration of liquid chloroform to an unconscious or sleeping subject without producing burns. None succeeded. The experiments, conducted on cadavers and animal subjects, produced the same result every time: contact burns, tissue damage, the unmistakable signature of a caustic liquid on living membrane. Whatever Adelaide did, if she did anything at all, it was not something that science could reproduce in a laboratory. If this case has left something unfinished in your mind, if the question of how is still turning beneath the surface, I would ask you this: what does it mean when a legal system convicts or acquits based not on what happened, but on whether anyone can explain how it happened? Does the inability to explain a method erase the evidence of a result? And does a woman who was purchased as a bride, silenced as a defendant, and then released as a mystery, does that woman deserve your sympathy, or does she deserve your fear? Leave your answer below. Tell me where you are listening from tonight, and tell me what you believe Adelaide Bartlett did in that room. Because I will tell you what I believe. I believe that somewhere in the early hours of January the 1st, 1886, Adelaide handed Edwin a glass. I believe she told him to drink it quickly, and I believe that the man who had bought her, who had controlled her education, who had loaned her to a clergyman and then reclaimed her body when it suited him, I believe that man trusted her enough to swallow whatever she gave him. And that is the most devastating irony of all. Edwin Bartlett was killed by the one thing he thought he controlled: the obedience of his wife. Claverton Street still runs from Lupus Street to the Thames. Number 85 is no longer a lodging house. The Victorian terrace was demolished in the post-war redevelopment of Pimlico, replaced by the concrete and brick of the Churchill Gardens estate, a council housing development completed in the 1950s. The street is shorter now, quieter, residential. The gas lamps are gone. The soot is gone. The stucco terraces with their iron railings and their damp first-floor rooms are gone. But the trial transcript survives, published in 1927 as one of the volumes in the notable British Trials series. Every word, every objection, every unanswerable question. And in the archives of the British Medical Journal, in a paper published 108 years after the death, There is a single sentence that captures what the Pimlico mystery truly was. Not a murder case, not a love triangle, not a scandal of gaslight and chloroform. It was this: a method so perfect that the greatest surgeon in England begged the accused to explain it. Thomas Edwin Bartlett, born 1845, died the first day of 1886, grocer, hypochondriac, believer in animal magnetism. Husband, he trusted his wife with a glass. She has never told anyone what was in it. The bottle labelled poison, not to be taken, was found inverted in a tumbler beside his bed. It was nearly empty. Adelaide Bartlett walked free. She never said how she did it. And the bottle has never stopped asking,